The Pacific sun, a white-hot coin hammered into an impossibly blue sky, beat down on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Sakai, his flight suit already dark with sweat, ran a gloved hand along the sleek green fuselage of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The metal was warm, almost alive. To his fingertips, it felt like perfection. At 55 meters, this machine was a god. It could turn inside any aircraft the Allies had yet thrown against it. Its two 7.7 machine guns and twin 20 cannons in the wings more than enough to shred the thin-skinned American Wildcats and clumsy Brewster Buffaloes. Sakai had 56 confirmed kills painted just below his cockpit canopy. Each one was a testament to a simple, unshakable truth he and every other pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy held. In a dogfight, the Zero was invincible. He heard the familiar, confident laughter of his wingman, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, from the next aircraft over. Nishizawa, already an ace with a reputation for almost supernatural flying skill, was leaning against his own Zero, pointing toward the horizon where a speck of a reconnaissance plane had just vanished. "Another day, another turkey shoot, Saburo-san," Nishizawa called out, his voice carrying over the low rumble of the ship's engines and the wind whipping across the deck. "I heard the Americans call their new fighter the Wildcat. A fitting name. It will run and hide, but we will still find it and skin it." Sakai allowed himself a thin smile, adjusting the white Hachimaki headband around his forehead. It was August 7, 1942. Below them, the sea around Guadalcanal churned with the violence of the ongoing invasion. The mood aboard the carriers of the Kaido Butai, though tempered by recent losses at Midway, remained one of profound superiority in tactical combat. They had swept the skies clean from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. The Zero's legend was not propaganda. It was a ledger written in the smoke of falling Allied aircraft. American pilots, they believed, were brave but undisciplined, reliant on rugged aircraft that could take punishment but could not dance. The Zero danced. It was a samurai's sword. The American fighters were blunt clubs. What Sakai, Nishizawa, and the entire Japanese Naval Air Command could not fathom, as they prepared to launch another sortie against the American beachhead at Henderson Field, was that their technical and tactical playbook was already obsolete. Their intelligence assessments, based on triumphs over the F4F Wildcat, were catastrophically blind to what was already rolling off assembly lines in the United States. They laughed at the crude, sturdy American designs, seeing only what they lacked in finesse. They had no conception of an industrial philosophy that valued survival over elegance, quantity over perfection, and a capacity for brutal, rapid evolution that would render their cherished supremacy a fleeting memory. The first encounters with this new reality would be dismissed as anomalies. The next would be met with confusion, and the ones after that would introduce a fear they had never before felt in the cockpit, the chilling understanding that they were not just outflown, but fundamentally outbuilt. The confidence of the Japanese naval aviator in 1942 was not baseless arrogance. It was forged in a crucible of stunning victories. From the devastating surprise at Pearl Harbor to the sinking of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, the Zero had been the spearhead. Its performance parameters in the hands of a veteran pilot were terrifying to those who faced it. With a power-to-weight ratio that seemed to defy physics, it could climb at over 45 feet per minute, far outstripping the American F4F Wildcat. Its turning radius was so tight it could seemingly orbit an opponent. At the start of the war, U.S. intelligence estimates of its capabilities were so wildly inaccurate that pilots were advised to avoid turning fights at all costs, a directive born from the wreckage of those early battles. Japanese naval doctrine and the Zero itself were products of a specific philosophy, the decisive battle. The aircraft was designed to be light, immensely long-ranged to strike far from its carriers, and supremely maneuverable to win the climactic fleet engagement. Armor for the pilot, Too heavy, self-sealing fuel tanks, added weight and complexity. The pilot was the armor. His skill was the protection. This trade-off created a fighter of breathtaking performance that dominated the early war skies. The reports that filtered back to Tokyo after every engagement reinforced this worldview. American tactics were judged as clumsy and individualistic. Their aircraft, while tough, were slow and lacked the killer instinct of the Zero. A captured U.S. pilot's manual, translated and studied, advised Wildcat pilots, "Do not try to outturn a Zero. Use your superior diving speed and armament in hit-and-run attacks." To the Japanese, this was an admission of inferiority. They controlled the vertical and horizontal plane of the battle. They were the masters of the dogfight. This perception was cemented by cultural lenses. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized individual skill, honor, and the spirit of the fighter. The machine was an extension of the pilot's will. American society was seen as soft, materialistic, and incapable of producing men with the same fighting spirit. Technical intelligence reports, based on pre-war analysis and early combat, consistently underestimated American industrial capacity and innovative grit. A February 1942 report from the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, citing German assessments, stated U.S. aircraft production was uncoordinated and lacking focus, predicting it would take years to match Axis output. It was a comforting fiction. The reality, already taking shape in the vast, shadowy factories of the American Midwest and East Coast, was a nightmare of scale and purpose they had not imagined. While Japanese engineers tweaked the Zero, seeking marginal improvements in a design they already considered peerless, a different kind of war machine was awakening in America. It did not reside in a single aircraft, but in a system. And at the heart of this system was a company called Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, New York, and a fighter that began its life with a nickname that reflected its appearance, not its potential. The Iron Works product, the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat's origin story is one of urgent, brutal learning. Grumman, builders of the sturdy F4F Wildcat that was currently taking a pounding from Zeros over the Pacific, had a front-row seat to the weaknesses of their own design. The Wildcat was a tough bird, able to bring its pilots home shot to pieces, but in a turning fight with a Zero, it was a death trap. The reports from Coral Sea and Midway were clear. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrange it. American pilots were surviving through sheer tenacity, superior tactics like the Thatch weave, and the Wildcat's ability to absorb damage. But survival wasn't victory. Grumman's chief engineer, William "Bill" Schwendler, and his team, including a brilliant aerodynamicist named Dick Hutton, pored over every fragment of data. They had a secret weapon, the Akatan Zero. In June 1942, a Japanese pilot had made a navigational error and crash-landed his nearly intact Zero on the remote Alaskan island of Akatan. It was recovered, shipped to the U.S., and meticulously dissected. Engineers at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego took it apart, bolt by bolt. They put it in wind tunnels. They flew it. What they discovered was both impressive and revealing. The Zero's phenomenal maneuverability came at a horrific cost. It was fragile. It had no armor plate behind the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Its control cables were not redundant. A few .50 caliber rounds in the right place could turn it into a flaming coffin. Its lightness meant it lost performance dramatically at high speeds. The ailerons, the control surfaces that roll the aircraft, became incredibly heavy above 250 knots, locking the pilot in. This intelligence goldmine landed on Grumman's desks. The directive from the Navy was straightforward. Build a fighter that can outfly the Zero, not match it. Outfly it. The Hellcat, designated XF6F-1, was already on the drawing board, but the Akatan Zero's secrets catalyzed a radical redesign. The original prototype was to use the Wright RA-2000 600 engine. After analyzing the Zero, Grumman made a monumental decision. They ripped it out and installed the massive, 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2000, 800 double wasp, the same engine powering the P-47 Thunderbolt and the F4U Corsair. It was an engine of brute force. The airframe was built around this powerhouse. The Hellcat was big. At over 33 feet long with a 42-foot wingspan, it was significantly larger and over 4,000 pounds heavier than a Zero. To a Japanese pilot used to the Zero's slender, graceful lines, the Hellcat would look like a barrel with wings. Grumman engineers, however, were not building for beauty contests. They were building a pilot's fortress and an engine's chariot. The cockpit was moved higher for better visibility. The pilot sat behind 212 pounds of armor plate, something the Zero pilot could only dream of. The fuel tanks were self-sealing with a rubberized lining that swelled when punctured to seal holes. The Hellcat had redundant hydraulic systems for the landing gear and flaps. If one was shot out, another could take over. Every component was overbuilt, rugged, and designed for mass production by a workforce that included women, known as Rosie the Riveters, working around the clock. The contrast in manufacturing philosophy was staggering. Mitsubishi's Zero production was an artisanal process. Skilled craftsmen hand-fitted parts. Each aircraft was, in a sense, unique. This resulted in a superb fighter but limited output. At the peak of its production, Mitsubishi and its subcontractors produced about 120 Zeros a month. Grumman's Plant No. 3 in Bethpage, New York, was a monument to American industrial methodology. It was designed from the ground up for the Hellcat. The production line was a river of metal. Jigs and fixtures ensured every part was identical. The learning curve was steep. The first Hellcat took 30,000 man-hours to build. But Grumman drove that number down relentlessly. By 1944, it took less than 9,000 man-hours. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The goal was not dozens of aircraft per month, but dozens per day. In February 1943, as Saburo Sakai recovered from wounds and new Zero pilots finished their training, Grumman delivered its 100th Hellcat. By the end of that year, they would deliver over 25 Zero. The numbers were incomprehensible to a Japanese high command still thinking in terms of squadrons, not armadas. The Hellcat's technical specifications on paper told a story of overwhelming force. Its R-2000 engine gave it a top speed of 376 mph, over 30 mph faster than the latest Zero model at that time. But speed was just one metric. It had a superior rate of roll at high speed, a direct counter to the Zero's stiffening controls. It could dive away from a Zero at will, the mighty engine and robust airframe allowing it to reach speeds where the lighter Japanese fighter would risk its wings tearing off. And then there was the armament. 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings, with 400 rounds per gun. The 50 caliber round was a sledgehammer compared to the Zero's 7.7 bullets. It had longer range, higher velocity, and devastating stopping power. A 2-second burst from a Hellcat delivered over 120 rounds of this punishment. The Zero's thin skin and lack of armor meant those rounds didn't just pierce. They shattered, ripped, and ignited. Yet, for all this raw data, the true measure of the Hellcat would be in combat. And the first whispers of its arrival were met with skepticism, then dismissal, by the very men it was designed to destroy. The initial encounters were fragmentary, confused, and easily explained away. In early 1943, as the first F6F squadrons, VF-5 on the USS Yorktown and VF-9 on the USS Essex, deployed to the Pacific, their missions were often defensive patrols or escort duties. A Zero pilot, engaging what he thought was a bulky new version of the Wildcat, might find his opponent accelerating away in a dive with shocking speed. He would report a new, large American fighter, fast in a dive. Intelligence officers at Rabaul or Truk, reviewing these reports, would categorize them. The Zero was still king of the turning fight. These new aircraft were clearly avoiding that kind of combat, they reasoned, proving their inferiority. The dogma held: if it wouldn't turn with a Zero, it was afraid. The possibility that American tactics had evolved beyond the turning fight, that they had built a fighter to fight on their own terms, was not seriously entertained. One of the first detailed reports came from a veteran pilot of the 201st Air Group based at Rabaul, Warrant Officer Kinsuke Muto, in late August 1943. After a skirmish over the Solomon Islands, he reported engaging a formation of unfamiliar blue-gray fighters. "They did not try to turn," he stated in his debrief. "They used speed and altitude. They dove through our formation, fired, and climbed away before we could follow. Their guns are very powerful. One burst severed the wing of Petty Officer Kano Zero." His commander, a veteran of the China War, nodded and noted the report. "Hit-and-run tactics," he concluded. "They have learned they cannot face us directly. This is a sign of weakness, not strength. We will draw them into a turning fight next time." The next time began to produce reports that were harder to ignore, but were filtered through a prism of disbelief. Pilots started mentioning the sheer durability of the new Grumman fighter. A Zero would pour 20 cannon shells into one, see pieces fly off, and watch in disbelief as it kept flying, returning fire. The term "Teko," iron bucket, began to circulate informally among pilots. Rumors spread of a Hellcat returning to its carrier with over 500 holes in it. These stories were often dismissed as exaggeration, the fantasies of pilots making excuses for missed kills. The high command in Tokyo, receiving sanitized summaries, saw no reason to alarm the factory managers or question the fundamental design of the Zero. Production of the improved AM-5 Model 52 continued apace. The focus remained on refining the samurai's sword, not on building a suit of armor. A few prescient voices in the Japanese naval aviation hierarchy began to sound alarms, but their warnings were muffled by bureaucracy and institutional inertia. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack and was now a senior staff officer, reviewed loss statistics from the Solomons in late 1943. The kill-to-loss ratio, once overwhelmingly in Japan's favor, was trending toward parity, then worse. He noted the increasing mentions of the new Grumman in loss reports. He drafted a memo to the Naval General Staff, urging an acceleration of next-generation fighter projects like the Mitsubishi J-1 Million Raiden and the Kawanishi Nun 1000J Shiden. "The technological advantage we enjoyed is eroding," he wrote. "The enemy is fielding aircraft that negate our strengths." The memo was acknowledged, filed, and its urgent tone attributed to Genda's known tendency for aggressive forward-thinking. The war industry, strained by bombing and resource shortages, could not pivot on a dime. The Zero would have to hold the line. By January 1944, the pattern was becoming a crisis, but it was still seen as a tactical problem, not an existential one. The American island-hopping campaign was gathering momentum. A new American tactic emerged: the fighter sweep. Instead of sending bombers with fighter escorts, they sent large formations of only Hellcats, roaming deep into Japanese-held territory specifically to hunt and destroy Japanese aircraft. The objective was not to protect bombers, but to annihilate the enemy's air power. To the Japanese, this was bizarre, almost insulting. It was a challenge to their very dominion of the air. They rose to meet it, confident that their superior dogfighting skill would decimate these arrogant Americans. They were walking into a meticulously planned slaughter. The Americans had not only built a better fighter, they had developed a new doctrine to use it. Hellcat pilots were trained specifically to avoid turning fights. Their manual, born from the blood of Wildcat pilots and the data from the Akatan Zero, was a recipe for killing Zeros. Use your superior speed and dive performance. Make firing passes from above. Never dogfight. If one gets on your tail dive, he cannot follow you at high speed. The Hellcat was the anvil, the tactics were the hammer. The stage was now set for the moment when perception shattered against reality. That moment would arrive with the clarity of a thunderclap over the palm-fringed atolls of the Central Pacific. It would have a name: Operation Hailstone, the American carrier raid on the Japanese naval fortress at Truk Atoll. And the date was February 16-17, 1944. For the Japanese pilots scrambling to defend their vital base, it would begin as just another massed attack. They would soon learn that the rules of the game they had mastered no longer applied. The first warning was the shriek of the air raid sirens across the islands of Truk Lagoon just after dawn on February 16. At the airfield on Etten Island, Petty Officer First Class Toshio Oda, a young ace with 34 kills to his name, sprinted toward his Zero. The sky was clear, the visibility perfect. Radio chatter from the lookout stations was frantic but familiar. Large enemy formation approaching from the east. Many bombers. Many fighters. Oda felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, not fear but focus. This was his element. He and his comrades in the 204th Air Group were veterans of the Solomon's meat grinder. They knew how to handle American formations. The fighters would try to tie up the Zeros while the bombers got through. The trick was to slash through the fighter screen and get to the vulnerable bombers. The Zero was perfect for this. As his engine coughed to life, he glanced at the line of Zeros around him. They were the latest model 52s, with improved exhaust manifolds for a bit more speed and heavier wing skin to allow a slightly higher dive speed. They were beautiful, deadly machines. He taxied into position, his mind already working through the angles of attack. The Americans would be in their usual stacked formations. The Hellcats would be up high, he thought. The Teco, he had heard the stories. He wasn't impressed. A big, slow target. He would outturn it and kill it. It was that simple. The formation of Zeros climbed hard, aiming to get above the incoming raid. At 18,000 feet, Oda saw them. The horizon was dotted with specks. He began counting out of habit, then stopped. The numbers were wrong. There weren't dozens of aircraft. There were hundreds. A solid, dark cloud of them growing larger by the second. It was the largest carrier strike he had ever seen. For the first time, a cold trickle of doubt entered his gut. This wasn't a raid. It was an avalanche. Then he picked out the fighters. They were not in neat formations above the bombers. They were everywhere, high cover, medium cover, low cover, and they were not waiting to be attacked. They were peeling off in pairs and fours and diving toward the climbing Zeros. This was not defensive escort. This was aggressive, wholesale interception. The Americans weren't protecting their bombers. They were clearing the sky. Oda's squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio, tight but controlled. All units, engage the enemy fighters. Do not let them through. The Zero formation broke apart, each pilot selecting a target. Oda picked a Hellcat that was rolling into a dive toward a group of Zeros below. He pushed his own Zero into a steep dive, confident in his ability to outturn the heavier American plane in the initial pass. He closed rapidly. The Hellcat grew in his sights. It was huge, a deep blue-gray whale compared to his sleek shark. He could see the 6 dark muzzles of its machine guns in the wings. He waited, holding fire, wanting a sure shot. The Hellcat pilot saw him. Instead of turning to meet him or trying to extend away in the dive, the American did something Oda did not expect. He rolled inverted and pulled his nose straight down, entering a near-vertical dive. Oda, already committed, followed. His Zero picked up speed, the engine screaming. The airspeed indicator needle quivered past 250 knots, then 300. The controls began to feel heavy. The Hellcat was still ahead, pulling away. At 350 knots, Oda's Zero began to vibrate alarmingly, the airframe protesting the strain it was never designed to handle. The Hellcat was just a shrinking dot, plunging toward the sea with impossible speed. Oda had to pull out. He hauled back on the stick, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces. As he leveled out, gasping, he looked back up. The Hellcat, having shed its altitude, was already climbing back up in a powerful, engine-roaring zoom, ready to make another pass. It had used its greatest strength, brute force dive performance, to completely negate Oda's attack. He had been outmaneuvered not with finesse but with physics. All around him, the radio was descending into chaos. He heard shouts, warnings, cries of surprise that curdled into panic. "He's too fast, I can't get guns on. My cannons hit him, he's not going down. Brake right, brake right. There's another one on your—" A scream, then a burst of static. Oda banked hard, scanning the sky. It was a swirling nightmare of contrails, tracer fire, and burning aircraft. But the burning aircraft were almost all Zeros. He saw one, its wings sheared clean off by a concentrated burst of fire, cartwheeling down. He saw another simply explode in a yellow fireball after a short burst from a Hellcat that dove past too fast to follow. The Hellcats were working in pairs, using their speed to make slashing attacks. They would dive, fire a devastating burst, and climb away before the slower climbing Zeros could retaliate. It was systematic, efficient, and utterly one-sided. Oda spotted a Hellcat lining up on a fellow Zero's tail. He turned hard to intercept, his Zero responding beautifully to the gentle touch. He was inside the Hellcat's turn in seconds, the American plane filling his reflector sight. He squeezed the trigger. His 20 cannons thumped, and he saw the explosive shells walk across the Hellcat's right wing root and fuselage. Pieces of metal flew off. The Hellcat shuddered. Got him, Oda thought. But the aircraft didn't break apart. It didn't even seem to lose control. It kept flying, trailing smoke, and then its pilot rolled and dove away, disappearing into the chaos before Oda could finish him. Oda stared, stunned. That burst would have vaporized another Zero. The Tekko rumor was not an exaggeration. A shadow fell over his cockpit. He looked up. A Hellcat was directly above him, having gained altitude from its previous dive. It was rolling over, its nose coming down toward him. Oda yanked his stick to the left, throwing his Zero into the tightest turn he could manage. The Zero's wings bit the air, and he pulled a hard 6G turn, his body straining against the harness. He looked over his shoulder. The Hellcat had followed him into the turn. For a few seconds they were in a classic turning fight, the one arena where Oda knew he was supreme. But the Hellcat stayed with him. It wasn't turning as tightly, but it was close enough. And it was stable, its guns tracking him. Oda couldn't shake it. The physics-defying truth dawned on him. At this combat speed, the Hellcat's superior roll rate and powerful controls allowed it to stay in the fight. The Zero's legendary turn radius was neutralized. Tracers streaked past his canopy. The Hellcat had opened fire from a distance Oda considered ineffective. But these were .50 caliber tracers, not the smaller 7.7 rounds he was used to. They looked like glowing baseballs. One slammed into his left wing with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting a tin roof, tearing a fist-sized hole and making the Zero shudder violently. The rules had changed. The engagement envelope was longer, the punishment was heavier, and the American fighter could fight in the Zero's own backyard. Oda broke off the turn and dove again, seeking the sanctuary of speed. The Hellcat followed, but this time Oda saw other shapes converging. Not one, but two more Hellcats were angling to cut him off. They weren't chasing him individually, they were working as a pack, herding him. The radio was now a bedlam of terror and confusion. "They're everywhere, aim no Yoda, it's like a rainstorm. I can't get away, he's too fast. My engine's hit, I'm going down. Command, we need help. We need—" The voice was cut short. Oda's own breath was coming in ragged gasps. The sky, once the Empire's domain, was now a hunting ground and he was the prey. He looked at his fuel gauge. He looked at the endless swarm of blue American fighters. He saw a Hellcat, seemingly untouched, calmly lining up another kill. The scale of the mismatch was no longer tactical. It was industrial, philosophical, absolute. They hadn't just built a better fighter. They had built 100 of them and launched them all at once. As he pushed his damaged Zero toward the cloud cover below, hoping for escape, a single, horrifying realization crystallized in Petty Officer Tashio Oda's mind. This wasn't a battle they could win with skill or spirit. The Americans had stopped playing their game, and the new game was one of sheer, overwhelming, mechanical annihilation. The laughter of the confident ace had died in his throat, replaced by the metallic taste of fear. The Hellcats owned the sky, and they were just getting started. Below him, the lagoon waters around Truck were already beginning to stain with oil and fire from the fallen. The turkey shoot had a new master, and the turkeys were all painted with rising suns. The metallic taste in Oda's mouth was blood. He'd bitten his tongue during the last high-G turn. The cloud layer below was a thin, shredded veil, offering no real concealment. The two Hellcats angling toward him were closing with terrifying speed, their profiles growing from specks to distinct, menacing shapes in seconds. His damaged left wing vibrated with a new, discordant hum. The hole torn by the .50 caliber round was acting like a crude reed instrument, played by a 300-knot wind. He had seconds to decide. The training, the instinct of 100 engagements, screamed at him to turn into them, to force the overshoot, to use the Zero's magic to slip inside their attack. But the new, cold voice of experience, forged in the last 10 minutes of hell, shouted it down. Turning would slow him down. Slowing down would make him a stationary target for their guns. He pushed the stick forward, abandoning the cloud cover, and pointed the nose of his Zero straight at the blue expanse of the lagoon, now mottled with the black smudges of burning ships and aircraft. He shoved the throttle to the firewall. The Saki engine, already straining, whined in protest. He would run. The two Hellcats altered their angle, rolling into steeper dives to match. In his mirror, he saw them growing larger. They weren't firing. They were waiting, conserving ammunition, knowing they had him in a trap. The Zero's airspeed climbed, 320 knots, 340. The vibration worsened. A seam on the left wing, stressed by the bullet impact, began to peel back, a silver tongue flapping violently. The controls grew heavier, the stick resisting his movements. The Hellcats, built for this, gained on him effortlessly. The lead American fighter, its 6 gun ports now clearly visible, edged into range. Oda jerked the stick to the right, then left, a desperate weaving slalom. Tracers, thick and slow-looking, arced past his canopy. One punched through his right wing, leaving a clean, round hole. Another sparked off the engine cowling. The Hellcat pilot was walking his fire in. Oda pulled back on the stick, trying to convert his speed into a climb, to make one last, desperate bid for altitude. The Zero responded sluggishly. As his nose came up, the world through the canopy filled with the blue-gray belly of the lead Hellcat as it overshot, its pilot having anticipated a continued dive. For a fraction of a second, Oda had a clear shot at the American's unprotected underside. He squeezed the trigger. His cannons were silent. He'd exhausted his 20 ammunition in the earlier engagement. Only the 7.7 machine guns in the cowling chattered, their tiny rounds pinging harmlessly against the Hellcat's armored belly like hailstones on a tin roof. The American plane flew through the fire without a shudder. The second Hellcat, having held back, now made its move. It had stayed high, and as Oda's climb stalled, it rolled in from his 10 o'clock high. There was no time to react. Oda saw the brief, bright flashes from its wings. A hailstorm of .50 caliber rounds tore into his aircraft. The sound was not of individual impacts, but of a giant ripping apart a sheet of metal. His instrument panel disintegrated in a shower of glass and splintered metal. A searing pain erupted in his left leg. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of cordite, gasoline, and something coppery, his own blood. The Zero snapped onto its back, the sky and sea swapping places in a dizzying cartwheel. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Through a cracked canopy, he saw the lagoon rushing up to meet him. The water was not soft. From this speed and angle, it would be like concrete. He fought with the jammed canopy release, his fingers slipping on the handle. It gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. The slipstream tore the canopy away. The roar of the wind was deafening. He released his harness and was sucked out of the dying aircraft as it tumbled. The force of the ejection broke his right arm. He tumbled through the air, a puppet with cut strings, before his parachute, torn by shrapnel, streamed and only partially opened. It slowed his descent just enough. The impact with the water was a colossal, white explosion of pain that drove the air from his lungs. The warm, salty water of the lagoon closed over him. He fought his way to the surface, gasping, his life vest only partially inflated. His Zero had impacted 100 meters away, leaving a circle of flaming fuel and floating debris. The two Hellcats circled once, low and slow, like sharks. One waggled its wings, a gesture he couldn't interpret as mercy or mockery, before they climbed away to rejoin the slaughter above. Oda floated amidst the wreckage of his world, watching as the sky, once his kingdom, was methodically swept clean of the rising sun. The drone of American engines was a constant, oppressive thunder. By 10 a.m. on that first day of Operation Hailstone, the 204th Air Group, along with every other fighter unit based at Truk, had effectively ceased to exist. Of the 68 Zeros that had scrambled from Etten and other strips that morning, only 12 would be in flyable condition by sunset. Over 40 had been shot down in the first 2 hours of combat, most by Hellcats. The American fighters lost in that aerial massacre numbered less than 10. The kill ratio was not just unfavorable, it was apocalyptic. On the island, the view was no less catastrophic. From a bomb-damaged operations bunker on Dublin Island, Lieutenant Commander Iyozo Fujita, a veteran flight officer with experience dating back to China, listened to the radio traffic die into static. He had not flown that day, grounded by a fever. Now the fever was forgotten, replaced by a chill that reached his bones. He had heard the panic, the disbelief, the screams cut short. He had seen the trails of smoke marking the graves of his comrades. Through binoculars, he had watched the dogfights, seeing the Zeros flail like minnows attacked by swift, powerful tuna. The reports that filtered back to the bunker were incoherent with shock. "They are too fast," one pilot who had crash-landed with a dead engine stammered, his face pale. "My shells hit them and they just absorbed them. It is like shooting at a tanuki spirit. And their guns, one burst and the aircraft comes apart." Fujita compiled the fragments into a preliminary report. His hand shook as he wrote the concluding assessment. "Enemy air superiority is total. The performance gap between our Type 0 fighters and the new American Grumman fighter is severe and likely insurmountable in current tactical conditions. Recommend immediate withdrawal of remaining air units and urgent review of fighter development priorities." He knew the report would be ignored, filed under the category of temporary local setback, but he had to write it. It was the only epitaph he could offer for the men he had sent to die. The scale of the defeat was not confined to Truk's airspace. As the Hellcats cleared the skies, American dive bombers and torpedo planes, operating with near impunity, sank over 40 Japanese vessels in the lagoon, including 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and dozens of vital tankers and transports. The fortress, deemed impregnable, was gutted in 2 days. The material loss was staggering, but the psychological and strategic loss was deeper. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm, already weakened at Midway and bled white in the Solomons, had just lost another irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots. These were men who could not be replaced in 6 months. The training pipeline, stressed and shortened by the demands of war, was producing boys with a fraction of the flight hours, sent to face killers in machines they could not match. The Hellcat had not just won a battle, it had broken a system. News of the disaster at Truk filtered back to the combined fleet headquarters in a series of increasingly desperate cables. The initial report from the base commander attempted to downplay the catastrophe, blaming overwhelming enemy numbers and unfavorable conditions. But attached were the raw loss tallies from the air groups. In Tokyo, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the 1st Air Fleet, laid the figures on the desk of his superior, Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta. The numbers were circled in red ink. Over 70 aircraft destroyed in the air, another 30 on the ground. Enemy aircraft losses estimated at under 20. Kakuta, a hard-bitten veteran, stared at the paper. "These figures are incorrect," he stated flatly. "Our pilots are better. The Zero is better. Check them again." "The figures have been checked, Admiral," Kusaka replied, his voice low. "They are from multiple sources. The pilots who returned, they speak of a new American fighter. Not the Wildcat. Something larger, faster, and far more durable. They call it the Hellcat." Kusaka produced another document, a translated extract from a captured American pilot's briefing memo, recovered months earlier in the Aleutians but considered low priority. It described the F6F Hellcat's characteristics. Kakuta read it, his face impassive. "This says it has a 2,000 horsepower engine. That is impossible for a carrier fighter. Our best engineers say the airframe stresses would be too great." He tapped the paper. "This is propaganda, bluff." "The pilots at Truk would disagree, sir," Kusaka persisted. "The performance they describe matches this document, and there is more." He placed a grainy, smuggled photograph on the desk, obtained through neutral channels from a German attaché who had visited an American factory. It showed rows of identical fighter fuselages on a production line. "American production, Grumman's plant. Intelligence estimates they are producing over 300 of these Hellcats per month, possibly more." Kusaka let the number hang in the air. The highest monthly output Mitsubishi had ever achieved for the Zero was 180, and that was before the B-29 started visiting their factories. Kakuta finally looked up, his eyes weary. "If this is true, then we are not fighting a navy. We are fighting a nation that builds aircraft like shoes. Our spirit, our skill, they become arithmetic, and the arithmetic is against us." He authorized the acceleration of the next-generation fighter programs, the J-Wo Million Raiden and the Nun 1000 J Shiden, but both were plagued by technical problems and engine shortages. They would arrive in tiny numbers, too late to change the tide. The Zero, the samurai's sword, was now facing a mechanized army wielding industrial sledgehammers. The pattern seen at Truk repeated itself with grim regularity across the Pacific throughout 1944. The American strategy of the fighter sweep became the standard opening move for any major operation. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, the final, brutal confirmation of the new order was delivered. Over 450 carrier-based Japanese aircraft, a mix of Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, were launched against the American Fifth Fleet. They were met by over 300 Hellcats, guided by advanced radar and fighting over their own carriers. The result was not a battle but an extermination. American pilots, now veterans in their robust machines, cut the Japanese formations to pieces. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day for the loss of about 30 Hellcats. The kill ratio exceeded 10:1. The few Japanese pilots who penetrated the fighter screen found the American fleet protected by a wall of anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with proximity-fused shells, another technical marvel they could not comprehend. The first Mobile fleet, the successor to the Kaido Butai, lost its carrier air power in an afternoon. The few surviving pilots returned to their carriers with stories of hopelessness. One Lieutenant J.G. Naoshi Kano reported to his captain on the carrier Zuikaku, "It is useless. We cannot reach the bombers. The Hellcats are everywhere. They dive from the sun, fire, and are gone before we can turn. They hunt in packs. Our aircraft they are too fragile." The Zuikaku, Saburo Sakai's old carrier, would be sunk months later at Leyte Gulf, largely defenseless from the air. The impact resonated beyond the cockpit. In a repair hangar at Rabaul, Chief Petty Officer Kenji Suzuki, a master aircraft mechanic with 10 years of experience, examined the wreckage of a Hellcat that had crash-landed on New Britain and been captured relatively intact. American bombs had destroyed the hangar before a full analysis could be completed, but Suzuki had spent 2 days inside the airframe. What he saw left him in a state of professional awe and profound despair. He dictated his notes to a junior officer who transcribed them onto thin rice paper. Report on examination of enemy F6F aircraft, wreckage number 3, the report began. The airframe is remarkably robust. Skin thickness is approximately 1.5 times that of our Type 0 fighter. All major structural members are redundant. The pilot is encased in armor plate estimated at 13 thickness around the seat and headrest. The fuel tanks are lined with a rubberized, self-sealing material that appears to swell when penetrated by projectiles. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney RMS-2800, is enormous. Its weight alone is likely greater than the entire empty weight of a late-model Zero. The cowling mechanisms are simple and robust, designed for quick servicing. Electrical wiring is bundled and shielded, superior to our own. The most significant finding is not a single part, but the philosophy. Every component is designed for mass production. Parts are interchangeable. There are no hand-fitted shims or custom adjustments. This aircraft is not a crafted weapon. It is a manufactured product. It is built to be flown by pilots of average skill, to survive damage, and to be repaired quickly. Our philosophy has been to build the finest sword for a master swordsman. Theirs is to produce 10,000 sturdy clubs for 10,000 soldiers. In a long war, their philosophy will win. The report was sent to Tokyo. It was read by a mid-level technical officer in the Naval Aviation Arsenal, who underlined the final sentence and wrote in the margin, "Heretical but possibly correct. Our resources do not allow for the sturdy club approach. We must continue to rely on the spirit of the warrior." The report was filed away, a testament to a truth too painful to acknowledge. For the men at the top, the reality began to force itself through the fog of pride and cultural certainty. In a confidential meeting of the Navy General Staff in September 1944, Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was presented with a graph. It charted the monthly loss rates of Japanese naval aircraft against estimated American production. The 2 lines were a study in horror. Japan's line, representing losses, was a steep, jagged cliff descending downward. America's line, representing production, was a smooth, steep ramp climbing upward. The gap between them was an ever-widening chasm. At current loss rates, the briefing officer stated, his voice devoid of emotion, and even with our most optimistic production projections for the Shiden and Raiden, we will have no trained carrier pilots or operational fighters left by August 1945. The enemy can replace his losses indefinitely. We cannot. Toyoda stared at the graph for a full minute. "The divine wind," he finally said, referring to the nascent kamikaze concept. "If we cannot match them in quality or quantity, then our aircraft must become part of the weapon, the pilot and the machine together, as a single, guided missile. It is the only arithmetic that gives us a chance." The meeting shifted to discussing the tactical implementation of suicide attacks. The Hellcat had not only won air superiority, it had forced the Japanese military into a strategy of despair, trading a pilot and an aircraft for the hope of a single hit. On the ground, the soldiers and sailors felt the consequence of this lost sky. At Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese troops dug into their caves and bunkers watched as American aircraft, Hellcats, then later Corsairs and Mustangs, roamed above them with impunity. They strafed anything that moved. They spotted for naval artillery with cruel precision. They dropped napalm. The once vaunted Japanese Air Force was a phantom. A diary recovered from a dead Japanese infantryman on Iwo Jima contained this entry, dated March 1945. Day 27 on this sulfur rock. "The sky belongs to the Americans. We see their fighters every hour, circling like vultures. Sometimes a lone Zero will appear, brave and foolish, and it is always swarmed by 3 or 4 of the blue ones and shot down in seconds. We bury the pilot if we can find him. There is no more talk of our air power. We are alone under a hostile sky. The only thing that falls from it for us is death. The industrial mismatch became a tangible legend among the few Japanese prisoners of war who were shipped back to the United States. Ensign Makoto Kurosawa, a Zero pilot shot down and captured off Saipan in July 1944, was being transported by train to a POW camp in the Midwest. The train passed near the Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan, which was producing B-24 Liberator bombers. Through the barred window, Kurosawa saw a sight that would haunt his dreams for decades. The factory seemed to stretch for miles, he would later write in his memoirs. Outside on the airfield were rows and rows of bombers, lined up like cars waiting for a driver. I counted over 50 on one side alone. As we watched, a completed B-24 was rolled out of the main hangar. Another followed it 20 minutes later. I turned to the American guard. "How many can you build in a day?" I asked. He shrugged. "On a good day. Maybe one every hour, sometimes more." I did not translate this for the other prisoners. The truth was too devastating. We had been fighting this. Our entire Navy, our entire Air Force, was being dismantled by the output of a single factory we had never even heard of. By the war's final year, the statistical reality was irrefutable and crushing. The F6F Hellcat, which entered combat in earnest in late 1943, would claim over 52 Zero aerial victories by VJ Day, accounting for 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air kills in the war. Its kill-to-loss ratio against the Zero settled at an astonishing 19, one in the hands of the best squadrons, and an overall average of 13-1. Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats. Mitsubishi and its allies produced approximately 10,939 Zeros of all variants throughout the entire war. The Hellcat outproduced the Zero while simultaneously destroying it in the sky. The United States built more Hellcats in 1943 alone than Japan built Zeros in 1942, 1943, and 1944 combined. The pilot corps suffered even more. Japan lost over 25,000 trained naval and army aviators during the war. The United States, with its robust training pipeline and survivable aircraft, lost a fraction of that number and could replace them. The arithmetic was absolute. For the aces who had once ruled the Pacific skies, the journey was a personal descent from invincibility to obsolescence. Saburo Sakai, the veteran from the Zuikaku's deck in 1942, survived the war, but his later missions were flights of survival, not conquest. After being severely wounded in 1942, he returned to combat in 1944, flying the latest Zero model against the very Hellcat onslaught. In his autobiography, he described the feeling. "The Hellcat was the first American fighter that truly frightened me. I could outturn it, yes, but only if I saw it coming from far away and could set the conditions. But they never let us do that. They always had the altitude, the speed, the initiative. They would dive, shoot, and be gone. If you chased one, another would be diving on you from above. Their aircraft could take hits that would destroy a Zero. And there were so many of them. The sky was never empty. Before we hunted. Now we were hunted. The soul of the samurai was no match for the engine of Detroit." Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the legendary devil and Sakai's laughing wingman from that August day in 1942, was not so fortunate. In October 1944, he was a passenger on a transport plane, being transferred to a new base, when it was intercepted and shot down by a group of Hellcats. The greatest ace of the Japanese Navy, a man who had mastered the Zero like no other, died without a cockpit around him, without controls in his hands, a passive victim of the air superiority his enemies now wielded like a weapon. He was killed not in a duel of skill, but in a routine application of overwhelming force. His death was a metaphor for the entire air war. The final, tragic attempt to adapt came too late. The Kawanishi Nun 1000J Shiden, codenamed George by the Allies, was a formidable fighter born from a float-plane design. It was powerful, well-armed, and had a performance that could challenge a Hellcat. But it was complex, tricky to fly, and plagued by a weak landing gear. More critically, its Nakajima Hamair engine was unreliable and in desperately short supply. Only 1,435 were ever built. They appeared in small numbers over the Philippines and Okinawa in 1944-45, flown by the last remaining veterans. In their hands, the Shiden could give a Hellcat pilot a real fight, but there were never enough of them. They were drops of quality in an ocean of American quantity. A captured Japanese flight manual for the Shiden, analyzed by U.S. intelligence, contained a poignant note in the introduction. This aircraft has the capability to engage the F6F Hellcat on equal terms. Use its strengths aggressively, but conserve your force. We cannot replace these aircraft easily. The enemy can. When the war ended in August 1945, the landscape of naval aviation had been utterly transformed. The Zero, once a symbol of invincibility, was a relic. The Hellcat, the Iron Works product, was the definitive weapon that had secured the carrier skies for the United States, making the island-hopping campaign and the final assaults on the Japanese homeland possible. The industrial philosophy that built it, standardization, survivability, and scale, had triumphed over the philosophy of the master craftsman and the warrior spirit. It was a victory of systems over individuals, of production lines over artisanal workshops, of pragmatic design over elegant theory. In a quiet corner of the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo years later, an old man in a worn suit stood before the memorial register. He found the name he was looking for, Toshio Oda. He had not died in the lagoon at Truk. He had been fished out by a Japanese patrol boat, spent months in a hospital, and flew again in the desperate defense of the Philippines, where he was finally killed. The old man was Saburo Sakai. He placed a small offering on the altar. His thoughts were not of grand strategy or industrial output, but of a specific moment on a hot flight deck, the smell of salt and oil, the feel of warm, perfect metal under his glove, and the confident laughter of a friend who believed they owned the sky. That sky was gone now, lost not just to defeat, but to a new age they had failed to understand until it was too late. The Zero had been a god at 55 meters, but the Americans had built something greater than a god. They had built a machine that could kill gods, and they had built it by the thousands. The ledger of kills was now closed, its final entry written not in the smoke of falling Allied aircraft, but in the silent, empty expanse of a Pacific sky that no longer belonged to them.